Hey everybody, you might notice something a little different today, namely the fact that my voice sounds a little bit more clear and you can't see me standing in front of a Doctor Who poster and a couple of fading blacklight reactive posters I've had for over a decade while moving my hands around like a spastic. So welcome to the new format of Trigger Warning. After much deliberation, I've decided to retire the old format in favor of this audio-only format. This doesn't mean that I've given up on making full-on videos, only that future videos will be of higher quality, and videos which consist of me talking about shit will come out with greater frequency. To put this into a better context, your average trigger warning episode took between 8 to 12 hours to film, transcode, edit, and render, especially on my piece of shit computer. As a single dad with a full-time job, my time is pretty valuable, and I pretty much have to sacrifice an entire day's worth of work in order to get it done. For the amount of things that I want to talk about, this isn't the most efficient use of my time. So with that said, there are a few topics that I want to cover today, all concerning trigger warnings. Now, as I've mentioned on Twitter, there's a specific reason I chose to call this series Trigger Warning. First off, because I know for a fact many of my opinions are going to offend social justice warriors, so I felt it was better to warn them up front so that if they do get offended by what I have to say, they really have no excuse. Secondly, because the type of person who enjoys the content I produce is generally the sort of person who scoffs at trigger warnings. Hence the joke. But as of yet, I've not really addressed the actual topic of trigger warnings, or shared my opinion on them. So let's go back to the beginning. A trigger warning, or trauma trigger, is defined as an experience that causes someone to recall a previous traumatic memory, although the trigger itself does not need to be frightening or traumatic. It's said to be related to post-traumatic stress disorder and can sometimes exacerbate PTSD. Over the past few years in particular, we've seen the increased advocacy for trigger warnings both on social media and, more frequently, academia, including educational textbooks. The idea behind them being that in order for a trauma survivor to begin the healing process, they need an environment in which they do not feel threatened, a safe space in which their comfort is assured and they are able to remain calm. Advocates of trigger warnings have suggested that trigger warnings be present on most forms of media, from classic American literature such as Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn for racial slurs when naming the character Nigger Jim, who I might add is probably the best character in the book, and I firmly believe the book was Twain's call for an understanding of racial issues, and spreading out to everything from movies and video games to textbooks and academic papers. Some argue that such measures are necessary to help PTSD sufferers heal. But I think that trigger warnings do the exact opposite of that. I think it prevents PTSD sufferers from healing. Not only that, but it's inspired a culture of quote-unquote self-diagnosed PTSD sufferers to advocate for this. Many of whom claim that their PTSD comes from social media. Our friend, adult film actress Mercedes Carrera, recently addressed her thoughts on the topic on a recent live stream with fellow YouTuber Liberal Lunacy. Here's what they had to say.
Saying you can get PTSD from a tweet is probably one of the dumbest things I've ever heard in my life, and I've heard some really stupid shit. So
yeah. Well, it's diminishing to people who've actually experienced violence. It's especially insulting to, like when they compare somebody who is a military soldier who was in a war
right.
zone. I mean, that crazy woman, I don't even know her name, but she's
Melody something or something.
Yeah, she's comparing the mean tweets she gets. I mean, stay the fuck off Twitter then. Just stay off of it.
Extremely well said. If social media caused your PTSD, then stay the hell off of social media. Not just that, but I find it incredibly diminishing and frankly insulting to actual sufferers of PTSD and survivors of rape trauma to claim that social media caused PTSD is in any way comparable to PTSD caused by abuse, torture, or being in the middle of a war zone. Now, I'll admit that I don't suffer from PTSD, but I know people who have. I actually have a friend who served with the Republic of Korea Armed Forces before immigrating to Canada. One night, after a few beers, he shared one of his experiences in Iraq in which he was not only fired upon, but saw men in his company killed right in front of him. Men he'd trained with, men he'd served with for years. And to this day, he tells me he can still smell their blood. But he was a survivor. And moreover, he didn't need trigger warnings. He asserted that the best way to overcome his PTSD was to face it head on. He wasn't an idiot. He's a pretty smart guy. And we hear all the time advice from people that are far more accomplished than many of us. Confront your fears. Because if you continue to avoid them, you'll only continue to fear them. Which brings us back to trigger warnings. Do they make sense? Really? After all, we place ratings on movies and video games, so what difference does it make if we put them on textbooks? Well, here's my opinion on the matter. Ratings on movies and video games serve a valuable purpose. It's there to let parents know that said movies and games may have content that their children are not quite ready to understand. But after the age of 18, it's generally assumed that those same children are mature enough to decide on their own if the content of said games and movies are actually going to bother them. And yet, we have adults in universities all over the Western world demanding to be treated as children? To be clear, if an author feels it prudent to place a trigger warning on his or her work of fiction, they should, by all means. But should it be mandatory? Absolutely not. But I'm not against people advising for trigger warnings on such things. But it has no place in universities, textbooks, or classrooms in which the entire point is to challenge preconceived notions and think critically about the subject matter provided. In 2014, student leaders at the University of California in Santa Barbara passed a resolution urging officials to institute mandatory trigger warnings on the class syllabus. So I'm going to say this as clearly as I can. That is among one of the stupidest ideas that I've ever had the misfortune to hear. How do you expect to learn to become an expert in a field if there are certain topics that you refuse to learn? How do you expect to be taken seriously as an adult if you consistently demand to be treated as a child, but then demand to be respected as an adult? One or the other. Can't have it both ways. If you're in university, it's assumed that you are an adult, or at least close enough to maturity that you can handle the subject matter. Trigger warnings promote weakness. Now, I'm not suggesting that being weak in one area or another makes you less of a person. It merely makes you flawed, just like everyone else on the planet. But I fervently believe that promoting weakness and allowing weakness an avenue in which to flourish doesn't just harm yourself, it actively harms the larger society that allows such weaknesses to flourish. We often see the cliche in some of our favorite stories that it's the duty of the strong to protect the weak. But is it really their duty? I in no way believe that might or popular opinion automatically makes something right or wrong, but I don't for a second think it's the duty of the strong to protect the weak, least of all from themselves, because that excuses those weaknesses. I think it's the duty of the strong, if they truly want to make a difference, to inspire those weak of heart and weak of mind to better themselves, to build themselves up, to strengthen themselves. That, in my opinion, is the best way to move forward within the framework of the human condition. Now, many of us are gamers. So as a gamer, could you imagine playing and actually enjoying a game in which the purpose isn't to strengthen oneself to face and overcome adversity, but to grow continually weaker and ineffective against your enemies as the game moves on? Now, could you ever imagine such a game becoming successful? This idea belies the actual concept of success, the concept of growth. Trigger warnings do not promote growth. It gives weakness an excuse to promote greater weakness. The adversity that proponents of trigger warnings face and attempt to surmount only serves to make themselves and others weaker by definition. This is not progressive. This literally, in no uncertain terms, is regressive. But thankfully, I'm not alone in thinking this way. Internationally renowned trauma researcher, Turkish psychiatrist Metin Basoglu had this to say on the topic of trigger warnings. The media should actually, quite the contrary, instead of encouraging a culture of avoidance, they should be encouraging exposure. Most trauma survivors avoid situations that remind them of the experience. Avoidance means helplessness, and helplessness means depression. That's not good. In closing, if mature adults continue to insist that they be treated like children, then I'm okay with people doing just that if they feel they need to. But I, for one, am not going to sit back and be called oppressive for insisting that they're adults and should act like them. So anyway, guys, that's it for now. Let me know in the comments on what your opinions on trigger warnings are, and be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And let me know what you think of this new format, and I'll see you soon.